So I have been a product manager for a long time. I started back in 2004. So the profession's been around for a long time. It's still massively misunderstood. Often starting with a company, they don't really know what to do with you, right? But how to do the job has changed tremendously in that amount of time. So over that time, I've worked with a lot of different companies. For the first 11 years of working in software, which predated 2004, I worked in open source, right? And the first job I had as a product manager, they were still writing PRDs, if anybody's heard of that, product requirements document, and it was around 700 pages long because it was for an operating system. And it was written by engineers, mostly, or occasionally it was an idea that somebody had and they just threw into the backlog, or an executive was driving to work one day and he decided it had to be done, so they threw this all into a 700 pages worth of requirements. And you really couldn't refute all that stuff. You needed tools to be able to do that. Now, in all that time as a product manager, open source was really something that I was passionate about, right? I was an open source nerd. Then I decided I had to get out of open source. I had to move into something else. Not that I don't love open source anymore, right? It was just I needed something different. And so I started with this company called ZBox, which you probably haven't heard of either, to be honest. ZBox, they had this platform that it was an app that you used while you were watching TV. They called it a second screen experience. So while you're watching TV, you might want to know what's everybody else saying about this, or who was in that movie again, or things like what dress is she wearing, that kind of thing, right? So this company brought me on because their investors told them they needed a product manager. They decided to put me on the data and analytics platform, which was built off a contract with one of their customers. It was 10 bullet points, and that's how they built the product. Right? I knew nothing about data at the time, but you had to learn, right? And so that is when I started working in various products and companies that not only used data in the product, but also used data to build the product. And you really learn about what it is to collect data in the right way, about all the different libraries you can use to collect the data, about what data to collect, how to measure accurately. And so as I go through all this, this is a very practical guide to how to use data in your product planning. It's not about necessarily building a product based on data. It's about how to put some data behind all your product planning and your product planning decisions. So there's a few things I want to talk about. I'm not going to get too into the weeds. I won't tell you, for instance, how to create an analytics event or anything like that. But I do want to give a lot of practical advice. And the first thing often is, why does data matter? You go into a company and you guys are here, so you probably are thinking to yourself, I know why data matters, right? But sometimes your boss doesn't know why data matters, or the people who are actually supplying the money don't know why it really matters. So it's important to have these arguments to really talk about. And then there's what kind of data, right? There's different types of data that you can gather. We'll talk about the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. And then how do we actually do this? Some basic rules of gathering data. How do you plan for it? What are the tools you use? And some of the techniques as well. First thing about why data, and one of the most important one, is about this concept. I'm a terrible artist. That's supposed to be a tie on a hippo, right? If you guys have ever heard the term hippo, highest paid person's opinion. This is the biggest problem that we often have, especially as a product manager, right? Because the CEO or the VP of product or the head of sales is telling you must have this thing, right? And it's always based on opinion. And if you come back with your own opinion, you're going to lose because you don't get paid enough in order to win that argument. What you have to have is you have to have data to fight back and say, I know this is the right problem because here's the data that tells you. The second thing that it gives you is it gives you a goal. So as you're developing the product, you can put out as many different features as you want, but you don't really know whether they're succeeding or not. You need to know, where am I now? What's the number I'm chasing? And then where do I want to get to? What's a reasonable goal for that, right? And you need to be able to measure your progress throughout. And you may find that you're not making progress. You're actually going backwards. And so data can help you to kind of know that, okay, I went the wrong way. let's change this out and move on to a different strategy. And you can take all that data and you can bring that back into the meeting with the hippo and make sure that next time their opinion doesn't necessarily win out. And the other thing is, basically, if you start shipping software and you've said to yourself, well, I know analytics is really important. I know data is important, but I'm really trying to get it out quickly, so I'm just going to put it out without analytics, and later on I'll add in the tooling. Well, the problem is you just released a bunch of stuff and you have no idea if people are using it. So it's important to have that in from the beginning so that from day one you start recording whether anybody's actually using the thing that you just created. Does anybody know who that is? I'm guessing you don't. His name is William Ocker. And he was, I think it was the father of blind flying. That's not blind as in he couldn't see. He was the person who came up with the idea of flying with instruments, because sometimes you're flying in the clouds and you can't see where you're going. So that was an obscure reference, but that's the whole thing about flying blind. So there are different types of data that you want to gather, right? Qualitative and quantitative. Most people think of data as the second one, as quantitative. Qualitative is something you probably know, but didn't really know it was called that. And qualitative data effectively comes from usability studies. The important part about qualitative data is you don't want a lot of it. You actually probably will see the same patterns come up over and over again after the first 5 to 10 participants. So this is explicitly something that is not what some people will call statistically relevant, right? That's the biggest pushback when you get when you start talking about qualitative data or doing user participant testing, right? Somebody will say, okay, how many participants do you want in your study? And you say, well, just 5 to 10. They go, oh, that's not enough. We need way more than that. It'll take us months to get this data. And then as you go through the testing, you'll start to realize, I'm just seeing the same thing over and over again, so I really don't need to continue to do this. If it is something where you think to yourself, I need a lot more data, then you're testing the wrong thing. So it's an important principle to keep in mind. These are not numerical. They tend to be things that you're not going to get from data, right? A good example is I was working on this product that was a website to give you offers for your credit card, right? So you're a HSBC credit card customer, you can get a discount at Subway, something like that, right? And so when we first started doing it, we wanted to put in location data, right? We thought, oh, you're going to want offers nearby you. Now, had we released the product as it existed, as we originally imagined it would be, what we would have seen is that nobody shared the location data. If you're just looking at the numbers, you go, oh, well, clearly that's not important. The thing is, when we actually tested this with people, I said, I noticed that you said disagree to the location prompt. Why was that? And they said, I don't even know why you want that, right? And that's the kind of verbal data you cannot get from a number. You need people to see their reaction and see their face. You need to be able to ask them questions and have them talk through the process. I'll talk a little bit more about how to do good usability studies. And then there's the quantitative data. And this is where you need the big numbers, right? It's something that you can't necessarily test in a lab, that you want to test either across all of your user base or maybe just a subset of your user base. And you need the ability to actually know what a subset means, like all the users in a particular country, of a particular gender, of a particular age range, maybe users who've been using the product for less than 30 days, that kind of thing. So the quantitative data stuff is all about the numbers and all about large scale.
How do you justify when you have the hippo in the room?
Yes.
And you do a usability study with people, and this all say 5 or 4 out of 6 say, we didn't see the button,
right?
We didn't click it, right? And it's statistically insignificant according to the hippo. How do you kind of justify making a change based on 4 people's opinion?
Usually, what you'd do is you'd say, okay, I understand. You think maybe it isn't statistically relevant. How about we do this? We had an alternative idea. We're going to test that with another set of users and see how well that performs. Usually, what will happen is you start to refine that design, and you'll find that you actually get a positive result. But you need that first test to see that people don't see it. You can also kind of tease that out in the interview. Sometimes when they're not doing the thing and you know that somebody's going to come back and say, but it was a genius idea, you might have to do a little bit of prompting. Like, did you notice this thing? And they go, oh, no. What is that? Right? Or it's good to have a video evidence of this so that you can show that to them and you say, you see, they didn't get it, right? You made the button blue against the blue background or something like that, right? Or they totally don't understand what that word means, even though you do because you've been in the business for so long, right? So that's the other thing I guess it gives you, especially if you're recording, which I'll talk about later, is video or audio evidence of whether it worked or not.
So what would you say in example you said, so someone doesn't see a button, so and then when you speak with the hyper in the room, they say, oh, we just need to educate the users.
We just need to
educate the users.
Yes.
The software. That, what do you say?
Depending on the problem, that isn't necessarily a bad thing to do, which we can talk about later. There are things called coaching software. But generally, that's just going to be a way to work around bad design. So if it's really important for the application, you want to make sure that it is actually front and center and people are noticing it. So you need to understand why exactly they don't notice it. Whether it's because the contrast is bad, because they don't understand what the button means, or quite honestly, sometimes it's because they just don't want to do that. Right? Like, for instance, I worked on one project where we were doing authentication, and we didn't know why people weren't clicking on the Facebook button. Well, it was because for that particular product, nobody wanted to log in with Facebook. So again, you couldn't get that from the numbers. You just knew that the number was 0 or very low. You needed somebody to come back and say, well, I don't trust Facebook. I think that if I log in with Facebook, it's going to log everything I type to Facebook. So that kind of helps you in that regard. If you're drawing people down that way, I mean, again, you could probably say to the hippo, okay, if people aren't clicking on it, we can add coach marks to point it out. If people still don't click on it, it still means people don't want to do that thing, now that they understand what it is. Good question, though. Any other questions?
Yeah, sorry, we might cover this later on, but usability testing seems to be quite a granular type of testing for qualitative data. I feel like, are there any kind of other high level, I mean, with usability testing, you assume that they already have a product that they can use and you're testing for UX or interface issues.
Mm-hmm.
Do you use qualitative data or any other touch points with the customer at a high level to understand around what sort of features they may be interested in that they don't have currently?
Yeah. So the question's around, what if you don't have a product to test?
Yeah, at this stage.
How can you get qualitative data? So I'll talk about a couple of techniques later, but I think it's important to note that usability studies don't have to be done with a working product. You can actually do it with paper prototypes. You could literally draw on a piece of paper and you'd say, okay, you're presented with this screen, what would you do? And they go, oh, I'd click on that. Okay, take this piece of paper, put it there. Now what would you do? And so you can go through that way. That's actually not a bad thing to do really early on. The whole point of the usability studies is a rough cut. It's like, first of all, does this product make sense at all? Second of all, does the design, does the layout make sense? Do they understand from the beginning what to do? And then you can work on the details. Okay, so this sort of relates to your question, actually. In the very beginning, with your designs, when it's a really fresh idea and you're just starting out, it's really important to keep it simple. So what I have here is a wireframe design. With a wireframe, I'm specifically avoiding colors. I'm avoiding any kind of finish or polish. I don't care about the fonts necessarily. Often, we won't even use real words. We'll just use lorem ipsum. Because when you put in details, like colors, button styles, any kind of graphics, that's the first thing people start to give you feedback on. I don't like green. Or can't we make the colors, the corners rounded on that button? Or that picture really doesn't meet our brand, right? And so that's not the kind of feedback that you want. What you want is, okay, I understand this is a map. I'm not quite sure what to click on next, right? Or what do these boxes mean, right? They can't really guess what that is necessarily. Or this is a phone interface. Okay, I can see this, but I'm not getting enough detail. All I have is like a name of a place to go and the discount. Where is it? Right? And so that's the kind of interaction you want. You want to keep things simple. And again, it doesn't have to be a working prototype. The other thing to know is you don't need a usability lab. So you don't need this whole expensive rig. One of my clients, I've been consulting for the last 4 years, and my first client was a large bank, right? And so one of the first things I wanted to do was to do a usability study. It was that same product I talked about before, where you are looking for offers for your HSBC credit card. And you want to find offers near you or something like that, right? So this is just a web page you go to, relatively simple thing. The product had existed for 14 years, and I was revamping it, basically, or redoing the whole thing. And so I said, OK, I'd like to do some usability studies. And I said, great. First thing you need to do, go to legal. Get approval. Once you get approval from legal, then you have to go to the design team, and you have to submit a proposal for your usability study. Then you have to get on the roster for the usability lab. It's a 6-month wait, and it'll cost you 11,000 pounds. I was like, I don't think I have that much time. My boss said I have 2 months to ship. So I couldn't do that, right? So I kept it simple. What I did was I called 3 bank managers within London, and I said, I'd really like to come in. I'm an HSBC employee. I want to work with you on work with your customers on this new thing that I'm building, right? This is massively paraphrased, right? Obviously, I got a little bit more help than that. But I went into these 3 bank branches, and I sat with customers in the waiting room who were actually just waiting to resolve some kind of issues. And I had a script in hand, and I had my phone with an offline prototype that was super simple, because I had literally had half a developer and half of a designer to do this. And I just talked to them quickly about their attitudes towards using a credit card and a debit card and offers and things like that. And then I showed them the prototype. I only had 1 person ever refuse to talk to me. And within a week, I was able to make huge changes to the design and find out that people don't want to click on the location button because they don't know why we put it there. So it can be super simple, super cheap. You don't necessarily need a whole lab. It's nice to have it, but keep it simple. So usability testing is an interesting one. Part of the reason they told me that I had to go to the design team and give them my proposal for a study and go to this other, get on this roster for 11,000 pounds worth of usability testing is they didn't do the usability testing. They farmed it out to another company, right? Which is reasonable. Usability testing isn't necessarily an easy thing to do, but it's not that hard either. And actually, I always recommend that the product team does the usability testing themselves. And it's not really hard to learn how to do it. The very first thing you need is a script. This is effectively your plan for what you're actually going to ask them. And it isn't things like, do you like the product? Or is this thing your problem, right? You actually want to be very open-ended. And you start off with like general attitudes. The thing I talked about before, I was talking about just, do you have a credit card? Do you have multiple credit cards? Or do you only have credit cards with HSBC? Do you use a credit card or a debit card? And then we actually found out throughout that most of their customers didn't use their credit cards. And the program at the time only worked with credit cards. So there is a huge problem. Of course, nobody uses it because nobody uses the credit card. They use the debit card, right? And so that gives you your plan. The other thing to remember is when you come in, people don't like to hurt your feelings. So if they know you are working on the product, if you're saying, I'm the product manager for this product, or I'm an engineer on the product, they're going to be really polite. So don't tell them. Just omit that. What I used to say is, I'm a researcher on behalf of my client, right? I'm a researcher on behalf of HSBC. I'm a researcher on behalf of Gluru, right? The other thing I always say to them is that I'm just here to pass on the feedback. So I really need to know if you like it or if you don't. I'm just telling that to the product team, so don't worry about it. You're not going to hurt anybody's feelings. It's important for you to tell us whether you like it or not, because if you don't like it and we build it, nobody's going to use it. So it's important to kind of set them at ease as well. And you want to ask open-ended questions. Don't ask yes/no questions, right? because you want to get them talking. And a lot of the time, these usability people, especially when you're doing this guerrilla type user testing where you haven't actually invited them in anywhere, they're not always going to talk to you. They're just going to click or tap. And you have to kind of draw it out of them. Can you tell me what you're thinking here? Or you say things like, can you tell me why you clicked on that particular button? Or, I see you've been thinking for a while. What are you thinking about? It's drawing them out and kind of telling them, reminding them there's a person sitting next to them. And they don't have to puzzle it out. They don't have to figure it out. If they're having problems, just tell us what's confusing about it. The other thing is, if possible, you should always record the session. So if you're doing user testing in the middle of a Starbucks, which is possible, buy them a coffee, buy them a hot chocolate if they don't like caffeine, use your phone to record it. What I've done other times, which I'll talk about later, is you can, if you're bringing them into the office, you can use lots of tools that are on your laptop and are free to record the whole thing. But the other thing to remember is you always have to get permission for that. So make sure you have a little sheet of paper that says, just to let you know, we're recording this session. We're going to use that only internally and never release it externally. Right? So they come in with an understanding of what it is. You have a signed piece of paper, and it's OK to do it. And they're aware of how you're using this. This is a huge deal these days because people don't want their picture or their personal information just being shared with anybody. Right? If you don't have a budget, it's not a big deal. There are a lot of really cool tools you can buy, but there are a lot of real cool tools you can use without having to pay anything. What I did at my last client, which was a 15-person startup, was we used QuickTime to record the screen, and QuickTime also allows you to record the video. So you can kind of have a dual screen here where you're recording their face and their reaction, you're hearing their voice about what they're saying, and you can see everything they're clicking on while they're talking. And it's a great record to have for you to review later on, to show to your CEO, to show to the rest of the team of here's how well it did, or here's how well it didn't do. And here's where the problems came up. You can also have people join that remotely by just using Hangouts or Skype, or I used to use JoinMe. Any kind of like video calling thing you can use to have people participate. This is nice because you don't want to have 6 people crowded around looking at them while they're doing the test, right? Because that freaks people out.
I just find that this is can be really messy.
Which part?
This part, in terms of like getting that person to, through Skype or whatever video conferencing tool that you use, getting them to follow along, having it so.
Right.
Yeah.
I see where you're coming from. Sorry. So he was saying this seems really messy if you're going to be using Skype to try to run a usability study, right? OK. So there are 2 things here. One is when I referred to Skype, I actually meant other people just observing, not running. You would have me or you sitting next to the participant asking the questions, and probably another person in there taking notes, so you can focus on the participant. And then any outside observers, like the team members or the CEO, can use that. Now, that being said, there are tools, I think it's called usertesting.com, that actually does that, where you can do remote usability studies. But those are paid for tools, and they actually include lots of things to be able to do it. Like, for instance, you give them a script, and they have like a set number of tasks that you ask the people to do. So yes, it's possible to actually do that if you want to do that. And it's really handy if you're in the UK and you want to study users in Germany, because you don't understand why they don't understand your product, right? So it's possible, but you need specialized tools for that, ideally. Good question. So I'm going to get into the actual data part, the numbers part here. And when you want to start actually tracking the numbers, you have to understand exactly what you want to track. And this here is a really, really important question to ask. You go to your stakeholders, or you go to your team in a meeting, and you say, what are the questions you want to answer, or we want to answer? But the important part is the follow-up question of what will you do with that answer? Because if you only ask the first part, they're going to come back with a laundry list of things that they want. And they're never going to think about why do they want that thing, right? So you have to ask them, what will you do with the answers? Because most often, the answers they'll come back with is either I don't know, or they're going to come back with something that is 3 steps ahead. They've already assumed lots of different things have happened. And so by asking the, what question you want to ask and what will you do with the answer, we can be much more stepwise in how we actually gather the data. And I'll talk more practically about how to get to the right numbers or what makes a good question in a minute as well. So there are several things to consider. The first thing is this actually measurable? So ZBox, talked about it before. Application that you use while you're watching TV. Our biggest stakeholders were the people who made the TV shows, right? They want to know how engaged are people in the TV show through ZBox. Well, engagement is a really hard thing to measure. How exactly do you measure engagement? And so you have to come up with like, what are the right numbers and do they actually indicate engagement? So for instance, when I first started talking about this, they said, well, it's just time on page. It's a web app, right? But it's like, well, okay, so I open the page and I just set my laptop on the side and I don't do it. Or I open up the app and I look at it and then I put it down. That's not engagement, right? And it's like, okay, so it's how many things they click on. If they click on lots of things, well, maybe I can't find what I'm looking for. Maybe I'm just clicking on things because I want to explore around. So it's trying to find out what is an actual indication of what you want to measure. That's really, really important. The other thing is to consider what is a reasonable time frame over which to measure it. Return rate is a really good example here, right? So people may say, what's your daily return rate? How many people come back to this app every single day? Well, if it's not something that makes sense to return to every day, then don't measure every day. Measure every week, every 30 days. What is a reasonable time frame over which to measure that particular number, right? This will be especially important if you're looking at things like churn. How many users lapse, basically. They've been using your app for a little while, and then they just stop. You can't measure that in short bursts. You probably have to measure that over a quarter, maybe 30 days, right? So you always have to consider your time measure. And then the other thing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but these things should also actually help you get to your quarterly or yearly goals. And I'll talk about the importance of quarterly or yearly goals later, but that's another indication of, yeah, we could measure that thing, but it actually doesn't help us in what we're supposed to be focusing on right now. So once you come up with your questions, you know they're measurable, you understand the time frame you want to measure them, you know that you can quantify that, you can put it into a number. You have to think about what are the tools that I can use to measure these things. And the tools you use will kind of depend on the questions, right? When you're talking about percentage of users that click on a thing, that's a pretty straight numbers thing, right? If people aren't clicking on the thing, where are they clicking? Well, that's not necessarily a number, but there is a tool to measure that. And then why are so few people in Sweden not clicking on the thing, right? And now, again, that's not a number, and it goes back to the thing of like, well, can I really test that? Maybe I have to do a usability study. Well, not necessarily. There are tools that you can use to understand or get feedback from your users to know why people in Sweden aren't clicking on it, but people in the UK do. They fall broadly into these three categories. You have your analytics libraries, and I always encourage you to use an analytics library. Some people say I can build it myself. You can't. There are lots of free libraries. I tend to use Google Analytics. Some people use Facebook Analytics. Some people don't trust Facebook Analytics, and so that may put off your users. You have to be careful about that. You also have to consider when you're looking at these analytics libraries, how much data they use. On a mobile app, you have to understand what's the memory footprint. You have to understand things like, are they sending a heartbeat every 30 seconds? That's one problem I've had before, where the toolkit was actually made for gaming. So they had this heartbeat to see if you were still actually active in the app. But we made a keyboard that you use on your phone. So our users, who were extremely technical, figured out that we had this heartbeat going out every 30 seconds and assumed that we were sending everything they typed somewhere to this company. So you have to be really careful about what tools you buy. Can be free, can be commercial. You generally get what you pay for. And that pretty much carries across here. Google Analytics is free. It's great, but you have to put a lot of effort into it as well. So it will be a lot of manual work to get it working. So that other thing where I talked about where are people clicking, you can get this thing called a heat map. Heat mapping software. I've used Hotjar in the past. And it's really nice because if people aren't clicking on the button, you might find they're actually clicking on a different button altogether, right? And it'll even do things like they track something called rage clicks. Rage clicks are like, do the thing, right? They're clicking many, many times. And so if you were to look at that in numbers, you'd be like, oh my gosh, everybody's clicking on that button. But you actually realize it's like 5 users who clicked on it 400 times. Right? So it's nice to have that kind of thing. Those do not tend to be free. You can get free heat map libraries, but they generally are pretty low quality. So Hotjar is pretty good. I think that Hotjar has a free tier as well. So if you're just testing it out, you can actually do that for a little while. And then actually once you realize I need this thing, then you can start paying them. And the other thing is what I was talking about before, this thing called coaching and feedback. So there are libraries out there, again, some free, some commercial, where you can prompt users, right? If you notice that they're not, say, finding the little link to open up their profile, you can pop up a little button after a certain amount of time that says, did you know you can manage your profile here? And now they know where the button is. And you can see if that actually helps them. It was just that, for instance, I don't know, maybe they weren't looking for that or they didn't know they could do that. And so it kind of helps you go through that. Sometimes the problem with your app is it's really important that you go through a flow. And so people go into the app for the first time and they're thinking, what do I do next? So some of these things will actually take you through the whole thing. WalkMe is a really interesting one. WalkMe actually makes you do the thing before you can move on. Some of them will just say, do this, and then you can do whatever you want. And it says, do this. So with WalkMe, it actually says, do this thing, and you have to do the thing, and then you go on, and it kind of takes you through the whole flow, which can be really, really good if it's a complex thing that you need them to do. Or just tell them generally how it works, because you know that once they've got the flow, then they know it, and they'll just do it every time. The other thing you can get with this is actually feedback. So the problem that we had with users in Sweden before, you could do usability study, or you could just prompt them for feedback, right? So for every user that's in Sweden that doesn't do the thing, you can pop up a little message that says, we love your feedback. Why didn't you like this? Or it could be as simple as like, did you see this button? Yes, no. And they can click on yes, no, right? So you can find interesting ways to kind of draw out information about what's going right or what's going wrong with the application. One thing I haven't really put in here, but a tool that I started using recently, which is so far amazing but super expensive, is called Pendo. Pendo's fantastic because it does all of those things. And it does the coaching really, really well, and it will track your clicks on pages even though you didn't do it, even though you didn't put any events in. So that's one to look at. I just haven't written the whole thing up here. Yeah.
And for Opinion Lab, prompting them users for feedback, is this feedback as in also how did you find the product and like measuring NPS, etc.? Or?
That's a good question. Okay. Sarah, and did you mention Opinion Lab specifically, or?
Well, I mean, I'm just using Opinion Lab as an example.
Yeah. So I've used Opinion Lab as well. Yeah. So, sorry, your question is around what kind of things can you ask?
As in,
your answer.
Would you go externally? Like in my head,
Yeah.
if I'm asking for feedback at the end of a particular flow, right? I would imagine it's just easy to build because it's a rating system, and I can just build a
Sure.
video that says 1 to 10, how did you find the experience today, and that's my NPS score.
Yes.
So, or just a pop-up saying, hey, how did you find it? That means you shoot an email to customer support team or something that can accumulate the data. So, like, what's the benefit of using a tool like Opinion Lab as you suggested there? Or is there something else that it adds or provides?
Well, there are lots of tools you can use. I've used Opinion Lab before, and it's quite good. You can customize it quite a lot. But so the question is around, I guess, when do you use these tools? How often do you use tools? How extensive are they? And the answer is often like, what exactly are you trying to do in the first place? I never recommend really long forms. Most people will not answer several questions. Most people will answer one, right? So you should probably be pretty targeted about how and when you ask the questions. Also, people don't really want to read a lot of text. And so if you have a really if you have like 5 choices and they're both a paragraph, they're all a paragraph each, nobody's going to use it. The other thing is I tend to go for binary choices, yes, no, kind of thing, because 1 to 10 is very, very subjective. So one person's 5, maybe another person's 9, right? Just people kind of have different opinions about what it was. Google specifically got rid of the 1 to 5 star rating on things like Google Music because they found that people either chose 1 or 5. So why bother, right? Just say yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down. So yeah, you should be sparing in what you ask. You should probably only ask a subset of customers and sometimes ask for verbose input. You will probably get a response rate of about 2%. So you're not going to get a huge amount of people that do this, but it's still a very valuable tool if you can use it, because just that little bit of feedback often is enough to say like, well, actually this word translated into Swedish actually means dog, right? And you didn't know it meant that. Or this is a slur. You don't want to use that word, right?
Sorry, can you go back to the last slide?
Yes.
One more.
That one?
Yeah, this one.
Yes.
You spoke about reasonable timelines, which is quite interesting. So say if you come into a product that hasn't got any analytics currently,
Yes.
how do you kind of set these benchmarks, or what sort of, do you use a mixture of qualitative and quantitative like data to set these benchmarks initially? Like say for example in a company everyone's got an interpretation of how active their users are just based on interactions they had with them. But how do you kind of set benchmarks so we know exactly what an ideal user should be?
That is a good question. So it's saying how do you set basically the baseline for your metrics, right? How do you know what to compare against when you have no data? Exactly. So there's a couple of ways. One is you can look at competing products. Often they're going to be talking about their own benchmarks. But sometimes that's really hard to get. So quite honestly, you have to start with, I'm going to make sure that from the very beginning I have analytics tooling in there. I'm going to see how it goes for the first 30 days, and that's your benchmark, right? And then, okay, so now we know where to start. People are churning within 3 days or whatever, right? You know, they've deleted their account soon. Or they come the first day, they interact for 5 minutes, and they never come again. So now you know where to start and what's the biggest problem to address.
Paul, you mentioned about engagement, right?
Yes.
So on this slide, I think you mentioned about engagement. I guess engagement is a very, a very big word, and I guess it always demands to ask the further questions to what actually engagement means to the user or to the business owner. Yes.
So, and that's what prompts the discussion. So we had that slide that said what questions you want to ask and what we do with the answers.
Yeah.
That is the prompt for that conversation. When they say to you, I want you to measure engagement, you go, okay, how would you define engagement? And then that's where they come up with it's a time on page, or it's how many things you click on, or it's how many posts you do within a minute, right? And it's like, well, yeah, that is a number, but is it really an indication of engagement? And it's kind of forcing them to think critically about it.
So if it is something very abstract, for example, in case of your experience with Zbox,
yes,
and you were measuring engagement about programs, right? How if the user says that I want to know whether after watching my program they are actually talking about it or not? So it is outside the scope of your product. How would you measure that?
Interesting. Okay, so how do you measure data for things that happen off your own product?
Yeah, because that's what it is, no? So if it is my program, TV program, I'm an actor,
yeah,
and I've done it. I want to know whether somebody is talking about me.
Yeah.
After watching my program, and if I've been popular after that. So how would you measure something which is beyond the scope of your product?
I have not used those tools, but I know there are tools out there that will basically measure your social media reach or your media reach, like how many mentions within popular media, right? How many mentions within social media?
You can say that it's out of your scope.
Yeah, I mean, if you have no budget and you can't pay them, then as far as I know, there are no tools that are free to do that. But I know there are tools that do that, right? That can actually measure how many mentions of this particular thing within tweets or across Facebook or in news media.
Exactly. Call is mentioned.
Sorry, again?
The tool is called mention. Literally, the name of the tool is called mention.
Mention.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. That's your answer. Right. So there's the other thing about when you're actually planning for your analytics. Another thing to consider is how often are you going to need to change the libraries? Sometimes you'll use a library just to solve a particular problem. Like the coaching and feedback thing we talked about before. You may implement several of them before you find the one you want. Or you may put in the heat mapping software and solve the particular problem that you had in the first place, but then realize this is actually too much memory footprint. I don't want to keep it there anymore. So you do want to kind of consider how often you're going to be doing that and who's going to actually do that job. How hard is it? Is it an on-prem product or is it a mobile product? If it's a mobile product, do you have separate code base for every single country? Like you have to consider how hard is it to swap these in and out. And there are different ways you can kind of work around the fact that you may have to swap them in and out often or use different libraries. Oh, sorry, I just got ahead of myself. Who's going to make those changes, right? Sometimes companies, they don't have a dedicated person to do it. You can't get a developer to be able to do it. Sometimes it's the marketing department that's doing this, or the product manager themselves, who has to come up with not just the libraries, but all the events as well, like what buttons am I tracking, or what pages am I tracking? And so again, you kind of need to think about the toolkit of, if this is free, but it takes it has a huge learning curve, maybe that isn't the best thing for me. Maybe I have to make the case that I have to pay for a commercial thing like a mix panel, which may make it a lot easier for you to do. The other thing you can do here is actually use something called a tag manager, like Google Tag Manager or Tilium. These are nice because they will distribute the libraries for you, and you can configure most things, but not everything, from just their web-based panel. So you don't have to redeploy every time. You just say, now I'm using Google Analytics and I'm using Hotjar. It will, on the other end, install the library for you, and you can say, I want to track these things. Or when they do this thing, send an event that does, has that string, right? So if you don't have a dev team, it's nice to have a tool that you can actually implement yourself. And another really important one we talked about before, as you're creating the product, it's actually not a bad idea in your tickets to come up with an analytics section. Like, okay, I have a story that's about this new feature, and the last thing it's going to say is, and I want to track these events. So that now the dev team knows that they're going to have to be implementing a thing. They can ask you pointed questions about how exactly you're going to track that. Where do you want the event? What's it called? Is there any other data you want to add to it? So it starts that whole conversation. But most importantly, it gets it in there from the beginning so that you're not doing it as an afterthought. And they don't have to go back and do retooling, or you don't release something without the analytics in there, and then, again, you're flying blind. You don't know whether it's successful or not. So this is another one that I love, and I've built for a few different clients, is once you put all this tooling in, once you have your analytics coming in, you have a product dashboard that you keep in the office. You have a dedicated screen that maybe cycles through different types of analytics. For my last client, I built one in Google Data Studio. It's, again, a free tool, and it's actually really cool. You can build some great visualizations. It brings in data not just from Google Analytics as well, so you can bring in from lots of different data sources. And you can kind of like drag and drop and create different flows. You can create different pages. I actually set it up so I had 5 different pages, and I use this web-based presentation framework called reveal.js, where I just basically, for each page, it's an iframe URL of each of these, right? And it would cycle through on the TV. Now, this helps you in a number of ways. One, it puts analytics front and center for your team. They're always looking at the numbers. They don't have a choice because there's a big screen that shows them, right? It can help you to spot problems, or it can help you to motivate the team to say, like, okay, we did a release on Friday, come in on Monday, and now you see the numbers have gone up. So it can be a really motivating thing as well in showing them, what's going well. This is very DIY. Again, free, works really well, but sometimes some people don't have time to do it. Gecko board is another one that I haven't actually used, but I've heard good things about. Sorry, I can't give you practical advice on that one, but Gecko board for my hair is really easy to use and fantastic and purpose-built for this. With this one, I actually had to adjust it because I had to make it fit the TV screen, whereas Gecko board, that's what it's made for, to actually be a dashboard on a TV screen, so it automatically does that stuff for you. So again, really good tool, but not free.
So on Google Data Studio and then use Reveal?
Oh, reveal.js. It's a web-based presentation framework. Nice little tool, but quite obscure.
Was that quite secure? Was it security an issue?
Reveal.js, it's self-hosted, so it's as secure as you want it to be, right? And if you put it on an internal server, nobody's getting to it, or you just have to make sure you put it behind a login, which is what I did.
So I used Power BI and had some real pains with trying to get it out to develop by business.
Yeah. So Power BI is one that's come up as well. When I was at the Ministry of Justice, they wanted to use that. Again, it's an amazing tool, but there's so much stuff you can do, and nobody can find the things that you can do. Like, I don't know if you guys heard a few years ago, Microsoft revealed a study that said that 90% of the features in Word were not used because people couldn't find them. So that was the impetus to like simplify it, right? Right, so this is my last slide. And this is something I keep talking about, quarterly and yearly goals. I debated about whether I put this first, because it's a really, really important topic, whether I put it last. And when I started to think about it, I realized it actually bookends the whole thing. Right? So you talked before about baselining metrics, right? So you need the analytics before you have that baseline in order to establish your quarterly or yearly goals. But as soon as you have them, as soon as you start to know what the numbers are, as soon as you know what the problems are you need to solve, you need to have these to keep the product focused. And you need to have the numbers to say whether you're actually working towards those goals or not. This also helps you, if you go way back to the beginning to that hippo saying, I need this particular feature, you can go back to the numbers and say, that's not your problem. The numbers say that the problem is that you have too much churn. So we need to make sure that people understand how to use the product right from the beginning. And so you can kind of talk through that whole thing and use the numbers in order to do it. Also, it helps, especially when you have maybe a founder who is really, really super excited, but doesn't necessarily know how to make a great product. You can kind of tell him how you're going to help make him successful by saying, this quarter we're focusing on this thing, and here's the numbers, so you can watch them every single day and see them go up. And then, this is going to help you with your customer retention, which helps you with your monthly recurring revenue, which is going to help you when you try to get your Series A. So this is going to make you effectively a rock star with your CEO, because you're the guy you're the person who's giving him all the answers, or her all the answers. So this is one of those things that I cannot stress enough. And effectively, when you're doing data analytics and you're doing product planning, this is what you ultimately want to get to. You have quarterly goals, you have yearly goals, and you use this to measure whether you're actually being successful in heading towards them. And that was it. That was everything. Oh, weird. It just popped out. Anyway, oh, there it is. These two books are two books that I read years ago. I think I read Lean Startup back in 2012, I think. Soon thereafter, started reading other Lean stuff. Lean UX for Startups, written by Laura Klein. Fantastic book about especially doing usability studies and how to do them right. I give you guys like a really quick overview, but it's a really good book to read and a quick read. Lean Analytics is all about, he has this concept of the one true metric. This is a really important concept as well. It's basically saying, like, don't track 20 things. Track one number, and then there's other numbers to support that, but you have to know that, like, what's the one thing that's going to indicate the success or failure of the business, right? What's the one thing I need to know for the business? And then you can have other numbers that support that, but you need to understand and really think about what exactly you're tracking and how to get to that, what is that one true number. That one true number is going to probably change every quarter, or change every year, but it's important to know that. Yeah, so that's it.
Sorry, one last question from me. Is there anything that you can advise in terms of trusted data? I can put more complicated source where you have the luxury of having like a tool to plug into and build certain analytics yourself. Have you ever encountered ways or people kind of questioning the data you're presenting to the table?
Yes, so you're saying for internal stakeholders?
Yeah. So
people trusting the data that you're generating?
He's like, I know my customer's best being used if you actually been here 3 months and the data is not that detailed. So how do you kind of get the company on books to be data driven effectively?
It's a good question, and it's one actually. So he's asking, how do you get your stakeholders to trust in the data that you're presenting to them? It does happen, especially when you have a very numerate stakeholder, somebody who really knows their data well. And often with them, you have to prove that you've actually done the work to say this is an accurate measure. Or you're very upfront and you say, it's not totally accurate, but you're giving me anecdotal data and you represent about maybe 10% of the customer base, whereas this represents 100% of the customer base, right? So, and sometimes they're right, quite frankly. Sometimes you have to go back and say, maybe I'm not measuring it correctly. And that's fine. You get that interaction from them to improve the way you measure, and they're just holding you to it. But yeah, it's not uncommon that they'll say, I'll question your metrics. I've actually built that product that I built for ZBox, the whole data and analytics thing. There was some amazing data nerds who were like my audience, my stakeholders for that. And so I had to be really, really upfront about exactly how I'm doing these calculations. And I gave them the power to be able to download the raw data so that they didn't just look at the finished data, just to convince them that this is actually accurate.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So there's like a deeper level of explanation for different kind of stakeholders.
Yeah, different kind of stakeholders and different kind of products. Some products just, you have to be super open about it, about how you're tracking.
How do you argue against a tendency that someone might say, just track everything? Like the UX guy might just say, I want a button click on everything, I want a page view of everything, I want a time view of everything. Like how do you?
Yeah, that's another good question. So how do you stop people from saying, when you say, what do you want to track? They go, everything. I just want everything, right? And I get that a lot. I get that at companies that are data companies, that they love data, right? They're like, oh, it's big data, we can sort through it. The problem is they never do. So you track everything, and then they don't know what to do. It's like they're awash in a sea of data, and they go, well, I thought I would just spot the problems, but I don't, right? And so by being very, very targeted, what I've said before is I understand you want to track everything, and we do actually want to get to that point, but we're not mature enough as a company to be able to do that. So what I want to do first is I want to be really targeted about what I track, and then I want us to be really clear about why we're tracking that thing. And once we get better at it, then we can start doing opening up the floodgates and tracking everything. It can be a good valid thing because sometimes you don't know what you want in the beginning, and you start to track it, and you realize, I'm missing this data point, right? So there's something called a Lambda architecture, if you ever heard of it. I'm probably going to misexplain this, but the basic concept is track everything, but you put it in a super generic format. So for instance, you're just tracking everything and sending it to S3 as JSON, and then you can extract it in various ways. And if you find out that actually when you extract the numbers and you put it into a table, it doesn't actually tell the story you thought that it would, so you just ditch the table, you re-extract the data again in a different way, and now you can look at the numbers in a different way, and maybe it does what you want to do, right? But that's super advanced. That's not beginner stuff. Sorry, did you have a question?
I was on the same point because the company that I'm working for, they said, oh, let's track everything. So in a few months' time, if we want the data about something, we have the historic data.
Mm-hmm.
So
it can be valid. It's just I think it's a bit of a more mature way of looking at it because most often what happens is they never look at it. But yes, you're right. If you're tracking data and you're not sending a particular event, you're not tracking a particular button click or a page or something like that, you can't go back and get it, right? You have to just retool and then put it in again. That was the other reason why I liked that tool Pendo I was talking about.
exactly, what is
Pendo. I think it's pendo.io. What Pendo does is they just basically, as soon as you load the library, it's tracking everything. And you can actually specifically name things. So like you may go in and say, every time they click on this button, it's like the upsell button, right? And then you go to this other page, it's like untracked or untagged, I think it is. And you can see all the things that people have been clicking on that you haven't actually been tracking yourself. So then you can actually go back and track it. That also means that later on, if you were including some bits but not others, you can, once you change your algorithm, if it has the data, it will just add that into your data. So it's awesome, but it's super expensive. It's not cheap. So, any other questions? Yeah.
How do you, a lot of things are tracking, say, just where you're tracking, say, how your algorithm is performing on Facebook. Then you have completely different sort of metrics in your app once a user enters? Like, how do you kind of join those two pieces together?
Not quite sure. I think I know where you're going, but I'm not sure.
Like Facebook provides ad manager will provide you.
Right. Okay.
Right. Now, my cost of acquisition of a user is like £5.
Right.
And then, but I also want to see kind of what's the customer lifetime value of that customer if I'm acquiring them for £5.
Okay.
And but the metrics that I'm using to track that, the usage are completely different.
Yes. Okay. So.
There's a big disconnect between advertisement metrics and.
Right. So, if I understand your question correctly, if you're tracking the same thing with different tools, how do you know why you're getting such different numbers?
Or even like how do you join the data, right?
Yeah.
How do you connect the two?
Well, if it's different data looking at the same problem, that's one thing. That's combining the data, and you can use things like Google Data Studio to do that. Like you can use basically, there are lots of tools out there to aggregate analytics information from different tools. Some commercial, some are just plugins like Airtable. Airtable you can use to bring data in and combine it as well. And the question I thought you were asking is, if you're tracking the same thing with different tools, which is actually important to note. I had that problem, we had that problem at ZBox. We were using 3 different things to track user numbers, and the CEO was livid because the numbers were always wrong, and one of our customers kept saying, like, this thing is telling me a different number, why are you getting different numbers? And what we realized is it's all down to data sampling. When you have a large amount of data, all of these platforms sample the data. They don't give you the raw data. So it depends on the tools and how they sample the data. And sometimes you will get widely varying numbers for the same thing, like visitors, right? Visitors and users are particularly tricky when you don't have a login, because how do you know whether the person's on their laptop or on their phone or on their tablet, right? How do you know if it's 1 user or 3 users? Or how do you know if it's that person whose son picked up the phone and started using it, right? So you can easily see how that particular number is always going to be disparate, especially when you go across different tools.
I want to ask about engagement rate, because like engagement rate is obviously different for different things, like websites and then advertising is all different things as well.
Yes.
Because, people tend to get stuck on quantifying engagement rate without, there's no clear definition and there's no real way to measure it.
Yeah.
Because that's their way of assessing the effectiveness of an ad or
Yes.
product. It leads to massive issues of marketing and assessing the effectiveness of your campaign, for example. So I was wondering if you had any tips on how to combat that issue.
Okay, so how to track engagement rate, especially when it comes to adverts.
Yeah.
So this is one of my things that is kind of a bugbear. I don't like the number engagement or engagement rate. For advertising, it's difficult because that's what you want. You want eyeballs, right?
Yeah.
You have to find, in my view, you have to find another measure. Like, there might be some side effects to it, like I ran this ad and sales went up, or they visited a particular thing. You need some kind of really clear indicator, like I put a quick link in there and people clicked on it. You have to have some kind of action associated with it, because views, eyeballs are so vague, and they're actually really not a good measure.
Yeah.
Advertising, unfortunately, the entire industry is built upon it.
Exactly.
And so it's all about, like, for instance, I've seen news sites that have the read more link, and they use that to know if people are actually engaged enough to actually continue reading, or they'll do pagination just so they know how far down you went. If you want to know how far down people went, use something like Hotjar, which will tell you much more succinctly. Other tools actually will give you that as well. But generally, when you want to try to track something that's super vague, you have to talk more about what's a better indicator, a more precise indicator, and what do we actually want the effect to be. An advertiser doesn't want the effect to be, I looked at it. They want it to be, I bought the thing, right? And so sometimes that's an offline activity, which is difficult to track, but you can find different indicators. It's just sometimes they're not online. You have to find other indicators that say that that particular ad was effective.
It's a way of like connecting your funnel, because like you have the engagement rate and the click-through rate. The click-through rate isn't necessarily
Exactly.
the conversion rate, because
Yeah, yeah.
off your website, so you can't actually decide what happens to them after that. So
Mhm.
this funnel is kind of broken, which is why you can't say, oh, this led to more sales.
Yes.
So
Well, it depends on how you do it though too, because
Yeah.
for instance, you can use links with like UTM source and things like that, right? So, or some sites are actually use a proxy. So when you click, even though you're going to a third-party site, first you go through their property, and so they can actually measure the traffic through that.
yeah,
That can work. It also can be a little bit problematic with like privacy tools and things.
yeah.
So yeah, you just have to find another way to actually succinctly measure the thing. But it's more trying to measure the outcome and not measure the action of looking or seeing or whatever, right? Impressions is what they often call it, right?
It means nothing really. It's just like something puts such weight on
It
it.
is.
Like, oh, that means your creative was effective.
Especially problematic when you have like these adverts that actually get in the way and you didn't mean to click on it. So for instance, not just measuring did they click on it, but how long did they stay on that thing, or did they do something in there? So you have an action they can take on the thing that they clicked on, right? So you measure that instead of the actual did they click on it, because they had to get there from the thing. So you don't care about them clicking on it, you care about them doing the thing you want them to do on the other end.
Yeah, I guess if they put their mouse on it, they could have just gone off and got coffee or something, even though they weren't actually looking at it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's why dwell time isn't really, unless you're filming them and breaking privacy, there's no way to actually know
Yes.
what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Did I answer your question
Yeah,
somewhat?
Yeah.
It's a tough problem to solve,
Yeah.
which is why I haven't worked in advertising.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions? Thank you very much.